one. Hello, America, and to our friends around the world. Welcome to the Common Sense Show. We are the show that's freeing America one enslaved mind at a time, defending God, family, country, and we have a weak spot for the oppressed. Really glad you're with us. We have a terrific show for you today. We're going to be joined by Richard Serrett, and he is looking at the effects of music on you in ways that you probably have not thought about. But I'm actually researching the first cousin on AI, and you catch that over on YouTube. We're producing that, publishing that today after about 2 weeks of research. Anyway, we're brought to you by Noble Gold. They're the sponsor for this show, and we're coming to you from the Noble Gold Studios. Hey, look, the dollar's a mess because of the war. I don't, we're talking peace, but do you really think there's going to be peace? I don't. And I think we're going to see degradation of the dollar. And Dodd-Frank 2010 says that the banks are in trouble. They can keep your money, they can redirect it, they can bail themselves out, and they can do the same thing with your retirement. Well, I use Noble Gold to protect me, and you should use Noble Gold to protect you. They have mechanisms of protection, not just selling gold and silver, which is also a good thing to have. Going to give you the number to call them, and they'll give you absolutely no pressure. 877-646-5347, 877-646-5347. And by the way, I've been a customer of Noble Gold for over 9 years. Richard, can you tell us a little bit about your background before we jump into what we're going to talk about?
Yes, thank you, Dave. First of all, I appreciate being here and for giving me
Great.
this opportunity.
It's great
I
having
have
you.
been,
Great having you.
and it's great to be here. I've been, let's say, toiling in these vineyards for almost my entire adult life. I began in talk radio in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, mainly as a producer, current affairs, politics, and so forth. And then in 2000, the Brain Trust at a radio station in Toronto gave me my own show. And that sort of evolved into what I'm doing now, the paranormal, the occult, conspiracies, alternative, you name it, alternative history, archaeology, science, health, energy. And that eventually became a television show, which I produced and hosted for 5 years. It was sold internationally. In 2018, I developed a podcast called The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Originally, it was intended as a radio program. My partner and collaborator died suddenly, and I had to figure out what am I going to do with this. So I took it to Chris Jericho of WWF fame. He had his own podcast network. He loved the idea. The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone was born. Here we are 8 years later. And people have been asking me for many, many years to write a book. And so I thought, okay, let's sort of repurpose the podcast. And so I picked, out of the 40 episodes that I produced, I picked 16 and sort of kept the spirit of those podcasts, but I turned it into book form, not just transcribing it, but kind of rewriting it. I leaned on a lot of great researchers and experts and authors, and it's all in the book. Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone.
I love that title. Very, very, very provocative and thought-provoking. Well, I really believe that society is being manipulated on a global scale on many fronts. Everything from diet to medication to you name it, we're being modified in various ways. And I think none of the domains is as present or prevalent, I should say, as our, let's say, global conditioning. And are you looking at the use of music from a conditioning standpoint to modify belief systems?
That's certainly one of the many, many themes I cover in the book. The first section of the book is called The Beatles Enigma. And in chapter 1, which is titled Fab Four or False Flag, I delve into precisely that, how the Beatles were part of the so-called British invasion, which was supposed to be sort of this metaphorical title for this cultural event that washed ashore in North America in 1964. But what I propose in this chapter is that it wasn't just some happenstance, some cultural event. It wasn't organic. It was, in fact, engineered. And I know that on the surface, this may sound like just a fantastic and wild fable and tale. But when you think about, I think how, you don't have to believe in secret societies. If you don't want to believe in the Illuminati or the Bilderbergs or whatever, it doesn't matter. Just imagine that there are people with more money than God, and they have decided that they need to try and shape and mold behavior, the mass behavior, in order to protect their own assets and their own stake in this world. And so they're going to do whatever it takes to stage manage events and to steer the useless eaters, as they like to call us, in certain directions. And so the Beatles were unwitting participants in this psyop, if you will. I don't take anything away from the Beatles. I'm a huge Beatle fan. I think they were talented, they were funny, they were charming, but the machine got behind them. And had the machine not gotten behind them, they would end up like many buskers. You've probably seen them in the subways or at the bus stop, playing for quarters and dollar bills and so forth. Incredibly talented. And you think to yourself, why isn't this person performing at Carnegie Hall? They are so good. Because they didn't have the machine. They didn't get tapped. They weren't anointed. And so the Beatles were one such act, I believe, and there were others, but I focus on the Beatles. And when I say the machine that got behind them, I'm talking about organizations or institutions like the Tavistock Institute, for example, which was formed in Great Britain after the Second World War. The intent at the time was to treat veterans coming back from the Second World War for shell shock, or as we call it today, post-traumatic stress disorder. But they called it shell shock back then. So they wanted to figure out how can they repair these broken psyches. Well, it wasn't too long after that let's call it the British Crown, for lack of a better term. It's kind of an umbrella term. I'm not talking specifically about Prince Philip or Queen Elizabeth II, but the Crown, protectors of the empire, if you will, decided that the Tavistock Institute, let's flip that narrative around, and instead of trying to figure out how to repair broken psyches, let's figure out how to take the psyche apart, dissect it, slice it, dice it, put it back together the way that benefits us meaning whatever you want to call them, the elites, the owners of the system, the empire. And so they also decided very early on, and this predates rock and roll, that the best way to control the masses isn't through politics, it's through culture. If you can control the culture, if you can control the arts, and you can weaponize culture and the arts, including music, including rock and roll, and use that to modify mass behavior, social behavior. So that became, think of the Tavistock Institute's mission now is sort of like Sigmund Freud meets the Ministry of Defense. And so the Beatles became this psyop. And the intent was, let's subvert America's youth. They're vulnerable. We're 3 months removed from the Kennedy assassination. They're traumatized. This is classic sort of MK Ultra protocol. You traumatize the victim, and then you introduce a new meme, if you will. And the Beatles fulfilled that role. And so the British were trying to regain control of America. They lost the colony in 1781 when Cornwallis surrendered to Lafayette. They wanted to get it back. And so if you look at history from 1781 onwards, it's been an attempt by the British Empire to regain the American colony, to win the hearts and minds of the young people. And the Beatles were, instead of using red coats and muskets, they were using Rickenbacker guitars and backbeats.
How did they, what influence did they have over American society, and how did they achieve it? I'm talking to the Beatles specifically.
Well, again, because the youth were so, not just the youth, many people love John F. Kennedy. Obviously, he had his detractors, but consider that when the Beatles performed on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964, 73 million people were watching that first night. They appeared 3 times.
Yeah.
That first night, 73 million people. That's 1 in 3 Americans. And getting back to the Tavistock Institute and what they discovered about how they could weaponize music. So, for example, according to the theory, and I could be wrong about this. The people that I quote in the book could be wrong. This is a theory. It's not a manifesto. It's an investigation. But the idea was they brought in people like Theodor Adorno, who was one of the academics, social critics from the Frankfurt School. These were ostensibly Marxists, and they thought that the family structure was fascistic, and they wanted to destroy essentially Western institutions. So the idea is that they would bring in someone like Theodor Adorno and others, who was also a musician, and figure out, crack the code. What musical chords, for example, could induce melancholy? What musical chords,
Oh,
what musical phrasings could affect the emotions?
before you go further, first of all, before we get to the words, the chords, are we talking frequency effects on the brain?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So, when we hear songs like when the Beatles performed, She Loves You, Yeah, 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 or I Want to Hold Your Hand, it sounds very innocent. And it was
Yeah.
from their standpoint. But that quickly evolved or devolved, if you will, in less than 3 years into psychedelic music. And now the Beatles were talking about rebellion, not in a cheeky kind of way, but it was about questioning the church, questioning the family, questioning institutions and authority. And so that rebellion took a little more of a subversive turn. And of course, then they started introducing psychedelics into their music and into, subverting the youth into experimentation and rebellion,
Lucy in the
trying
Sky with
LSD.
Diamonds. Yeah.
We see the sky with diamonds. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So again, the elites figured out, if you want to control the masses, it's not about politics. It's about the culture. And one of the people that I lean on heavily in this chapter, Fab Four or False Flag, was Nelson Thal, who was the last PhD candidate student for Marshall McLuhan, the great Canadian media theorist. And Marshall McLuhan was very connected with intelligence people all over the world. Marshall McLuhan believed that the arts were controlled by secret societies, and Nelson Thal makes, I think, a very, very provocative and compelling case that this is what was intended for the British establishment, the British crown, to win back the colony by subverting the youth.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I want to digress just for a minute, and I didn't see the series a lot, but there was a short-lived series. I think it was NBC, but don't quote me on that. But it was about how aliens manipulated society, and they used, among many tricks, music. And they used the Beatles as an example. Are you familiar with what I'm talking? I don't remember the name of the series, but are you familiar with that?
Not offhand, David. Sounds interesting. I'd love to check it
I'll have
out.
to
I can't.
research that and I'll send you what I find. But it was on Saturday night. And I remember because we were packing to move to another house on Saturday night, and that show was on. I thought, well, this is interesting psychological point of view here of this. And it wasn't just the Beatles, though. They had all other kinds of manipulation about how they'd present the news and designed to manipulate you that way and so forth. But it was pretty interesting. And you just took me back to something I haven't thought about in probably 25 years.
Right. Well, and this is a very early iteration. Now they don't need to weaponize music in this way. We have social media now.
Yeah.
We have artificial intelligence, which you and I were talking about briefly off the air. It's far more sophisticated than it was back then, but it was very effective.
Wow, this is fascinating stuff. So, what kind of frequency modulations? I mean, I know certain frequency levels can motivate the limbic system to have certain emotions. In fact, I know someone that can do diagnostics on people by analyzing the frequency of their voices, and all the big boys are trying to buy her out. They gave her pressure. She goes, to heck with you, and she set up free trainings all over the country. So I'm familiar with this, but could you give us more insight to the lyrics enter into this as well too? And is backward masking a real thing?
Well, let's handle the backward masking. I didn't get into backward masking in the first chapter, although it certainly is expounded upon in chapter 2, where I discuss the whole Paul is dead legend
Oh
and
yeah.
how backward masking was utilized in songs like Strawberry Fields and Revolution 9 and
Yeah.
I Am a Walrus. Uh,
I buried Paul.
I Buried Paul,
Yeah.
although John Lennon claims he was saying cranberry sauce. I don't know how you could cranberry sauce and I Buried Paul. Another backward masking song message is Turn Me On, Dead Man, Turn Me On. Um, Now, just for the record, I don't believe Paul McCartney died
I
in
don't either.
November of 1966 and was replaced by a body double, but it is one of the most enduring, perhaps the most enduring rock and roll or pop culture conspiracy of all time. And here we are 60 years later, and it still has legs. So, from a sociological perspective, it's very interesting how in decades, almost a half century before the advent of the internet and social media, a legend like this could take root and spread by word of mouth, then on a radio station in Detroit with Russ Gibb, and then Roby Young in New York. It all started on a college campus in Iowa, a student newspaper. Someone wrote a column about the clues pointing to the fact that Paul McCartney was dead. Again, I don't believe that they managed to find an exact replica of Paul McCartney, who also played left-handed bass and was arguably more talented than the original. When you look at the body of work of McCartney pre-1966, still it's pretty good. You know, he wrote Yesterday, the most covered song in history, but then you look at the work after 1966, when he supposedly was replaced by the faux Paul. You've got, Let It Be and Hey Jude and The Long and Winding Road, plus his songs, his music with wings and so forth. But I did examine it from more of a sociological aspect. And then the question remains, the clues appear to be real, whether we're talking about the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album, all of the clues there, because it's laid out like a funereal scene, the clues on Abbey Road that came out 2 years later, the backward masking that I just mentioned. Who put the clues there and why? Was it clever marketing? Or if the legend is true, and I could be wrong, but I don't think I am, if the legend is true and he died, were the three surviving Beatles maybe had qualms of guilt and were trying to leave breadcrumbs for the fans to ease their conscience, to let them know, Paul is dead. We had to replace him. We didn't want to do it, but we wanted you to know.
Yeah, I tend not to go down that path myself. I think they created a legend to just attract attention and keep mystery behind them, and that's a motivating factor to attract attention.
I happen to agree. I think it was absolutely brilliant marketing because the proof is in the pudding, as they say. Here we are 60 years later, still talking about it. Now, having said that, there is some compelling evidence. There was some forensic analysis of some photographs taken of Paul McCartney with Jane Asher, his girlfriend at the time. In one, he appears just slightly taller than Jane, who was about 5'5". In another series of photographs, he appears to be towering over her. There was some forensic analysis performed on a series of voice prints, which are very unique. They're like fingerprints. This
Oh,
analysis concluded that the three samples were recorded by three different people. One was Paul McCartney, perhaps. The other one, I don't know, William Campbell. The other one, William Shepard. These were the two people that were rumored to have replaced Paul post 1966. So the evidence is compelling, but in the end, readers will have to make up their own mind. You and I have made up our mind. Paul McCartney is still very much alive and with us. I believe the clues are real. I believe they were placed there. Was it to sell more records, or were the Beatles? They were very charming, cheeky, intelligent young men who they were inspired by people like Peter Sellers and Peter Cook. They loved wordplay. They were brilliant at wordplay, and their banter was wonderful. I think they were just having some fun.
yeah, interesting. Well, I've got a friend, and I kind of alluded to her in passing here, Dr. Sherry Edwards, who developed the technology I mentioned about voice frequency analysis. And I'm going to take this premise and I'm going to give it to Sherry and I'm going to say, let's do pre-1966 Beatles songs and post involving Paul McCartney to see what she says about this.
I would
Uh,
love to hear the results of that.
oh, yeah. I mean, she's going to get my call today. She and I have been good friends. We've done shows forever, but this is fascinating stuff. Like I said, I tend to think it was all mystery compiled to draw attention and create mystery, that create more attention on the group. And thing is, they were so good, they didn't need it. They didn't need to do that. They were so good. I was heartbroken. I was a kid and I was heartbroken when they broke up. I
Mhm.
hated it.
Yeah, many people were, and of course, then again in 1980, when the dream died, when John Lennon died and
Yeah,
ruled out
yeah,
the
yeah.
possibility of a reunion, many of us, millions and millions of us, felt cheated um, because of what happened to John Lennon, and we were still fantasizing about the possibility of a reunion, which never, of course, happened. Another thought occurred to me though as we were talking about the clues and how it might relate back to what we were discussing earlier in chapter one about how the elites and the Tavistock Institute and MI6 and the Crown trying to subvert the youth and steer mass psychology and mass behavior. And that is that, here we were all chasing our tails in dorm rooms across the United States and Canada, playing these records backwards, trying to listen for the clues. That's a form of social control and manipulation and psychological. It's a psyop, if you will. Now, you could argue maybe the EMI and the executives who had connections with MI6 and so forth were using that as a psyop to see, well, how long can we get these people distracted and focused on following these breadcrumbs?
Wow. My mind is racing overtime here on this. It's just, wow. Because there is, William Casey, the former head of the CIA, once had a famous quote that I think applies here. He
Mhm.
says, once everything that people believe is a lie, we have accomplished our mission.
Yes.
And you're kind of touching on the perimeter of this. Um, it's interesting, but you're right. They did question religion. My older sister had friends who broke up their Beatle records when they started to speak out against Christianity.
Yeah, John Lennon's famous and unfortunate utterance that we're more popular than Jesus. And there are a couple of ways of looking at that. And if we want to be, I guess, kind, we could say that John Lennon was saying that in a begrudging way. And like, in other words, isn't it sad? We're more popular than Jesus. It shouldn't be this way, but this is the state of society. We're more popular than Jesus. I mean, you could make an argument that, in fact, he was right. It's a sad commentary, but he was right. On the other hand, you could be less kind and say that John Lennon was blaspheming,
Yes.
and that was one of many blasphemes that the Beatles participated in, and that is actually chapter 4 in the Beatles section called the Beatles Enigma, talking about John Lennon, his death in December of 1980 at the hands of Mark David Chapman, whether in fact John Lennon had made a pact with the devil, knowingly or unknowingly. And as a Christian and someone who believes in the unseen world, I believe that that's possible and that it occurs and it's happening to this day. We have a lot of artists that dabble in the occult. Sometimes it's for branding purposes. Oh, look at me, I'm a bad boy, I'm anti-establishment. I'm going to put a symbol of Baphomet on my
Yeah,
album
Judas
cover.
Priest, good example.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if they're not being sincere about it, giving them the benefit of the doubt. For example, Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. I don't believe Ozzy Osbourne was a Satanist,
I don't either.
or a witting participant in that. But once you make that invitation, even if you're not necessarily being genuine or sincere, you're opening a door, and you have to be careful what might walk through. And I think that happened with John Lennon. I mean, there is an argument to be made that Mark David Chapman was, in fact, a Manchurian candidate. He was a programmed assassin. That would be another chapter entirely. But in chapter 4, I focus on how the Beatles' meteoric rise occurred almost inexplicably. One day they were performing in Hamburg and at the Cavern Club, and then one day in December 1960, almost 20 years to the day, Beatlemania was born. And if you go to this hall in Liverpool, there's a plaque there, December 27th, I think it says 1960, the birth of Beatlemania. Something happened that night. The crowd went crazy. People were bringing sick relatives and friends, disabled relatives and friends backstage, hoping the Beatles would lay their hands on them,
Oh
which
my
is another,
gosh, I didn't know that.
again, blaspheming. And then, of course, the Yesterday and Today album cover, where we see the Beatles posed in sort of these white smocks, sitting there and with dismembered baby doll parts and blood, almost like a butcher shop, all over them. That album cover was pulled, of course, but many collectors will still have that album cover. Again, another blaspheme. So, did John Lennon make that pact with the devil? These pacts often last almost 20 years to the date. According to legend, it was almost 20 years to the date of that Beatlemania birth in Liverpool to his death in December of 1980. Was Mark David Chapman maybe more than a Manchurian Candidate? Was he the bill collector, if you will, who was dispatched to the Upper West Side of Manhattan to complete the pact with Satan?
That's interesting. I always thought Mark David Chapman was an operative of the FBI. We know that J. Edgar Hoover hated the Beatles,
Mm-hmm.
and I always thought his anti-war rhetoric is what got him killed. And I just that's my hypothesis, but they were very anti-war. The youth identified with them because of the anti-Vietnam sentiment, and I just wondered if that is that why? Because
Well,
J. Edgar Hoover, remember, tried to have him deported.
yes, he did. There was a huge FBI file on John Lennon. They did try to have him deported. His phones were bugged, um, and again, that's an entirely different chapter yet to be written. Perhaps it'll make it into volume 2 from Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. But I have done many shows about John or Mark David Chapman as a Manchurian Candidate. Even the homicide detective at NYPD who was in charge of the investigation commented to a British journalist that Chapman's behavior did seem very robotic and strange,
Hmm.
as if he had been programmed. Immediately after killing Lennon, he sits down on the curb in front of the Dakota and starts leafing through a copy of Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. This is a book that comes up time and time again in assassination research, as if it's some kind of triggering mechanism. In fact, it made it into Mel Gibson's book, or a movie, which was called, I think, Conspiracy.
That's right. It did. Exactly. I remember that now.
Yeah.
By the way, I just found the show that I was telling you about. It was
Mhm.
called Dark Skies, and it ran 1996 to 1997. And it said parasites plot to hijack the Beatles' historic appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they just went through a series of things where they were using aliens as the motivator for various brainwashing strategies in society, including music. That's why that triggered that in me. Um,
I remember the title. I didn't see the series. In the late '90s, I was still producing talk radio, still talking about, the workaday reality, provincial budgets and garbage strikes, and I had yet to be awakened.
how is all this manifesting today? Because I think AI is doing a lot of the manipulation that you are talking about in the early days of rock and roll.
Yeah, I mean, it's far more sophisticated. Everything is far more sophisticated. Um, some things are far more overt. They don't need to encode satanic messages in a Led Zeppelin song, "Stairway to Heaven."
Oh yeah.
Um, they just, first of all, I don't know if can you play MP3s backwards? I suppose if you put it into Adobe, and you could probably play it backwards, but they tell you it frontwards. It's overt. It's in the lyrics now. Instead of putting it backwards, now you hear it forwards, and they say, "I worship Satan," or they're flashing their Illuminati symbols at the Grammy Awards. Or a lot of these, the Super Bowl halftime shows, they're all these occult rituals
Yes.
filled with occult symbology. It's so overt and in our face now. That's one thing that's I think has changed since the 1950s and 60s when they were being a little more perhaps nuanced about it. So they're not shy about it. It's in our face. It's in every aspect of society. It's in the food. It's in healthcare. It's at the school board. It's at some churches. It's everywhere. It's a full-on invasion, infiltration, and of course now with artificial intelligence. I recently did an episode of my podcast, Strange Planet, on Project Bluebeam, and
Uh-huh.
this theory that began back in the I guess about the early 1990s. It was a Canadian rather, who first claimed that he had happened upon some NASA declassified documents, or classified documents rather, about the plan to stage either an alien invasion or the second coming using holographic images projected into the sky, which would deceive people around the world into thinking that one, there's either an alien invasion coming, or two, the Messiah has returned. And I was wondering whether, how close to the truth that is, and whether we've already arrived at that point. And I came to the conclusion that we don't need the holograph images. We don't need that kind of technology. It's all right here on our phones. Social media and artificial intelligence has accomplished all of that without the need for, I don't know, satellites projecting images onto the into the heavens. We're all tethered to these things, and we don't even need them implanted into our brains. This was another dystopian image that, they're going to put these chips in our brains. They don't need to. We're already tethered to this thing. It's already in our brain.
Yeah, I think you're making a very good point, but I have to step back and say I would agree with you. I've known about Project Bluebeam for a long time, and I can't really say how I found out, but I will say this. I still think it's a possibility, and the reason I say that is because of the government's behavior with disclosure.
Mhm.
And I think the Steven Spielberg movie coming out, in fact, he's even made an attack upon Christians. He said Christians are
Yes.
going to have to do some rethinking after they see this movie. Well, I'm sorry, it's not going to change most Christians' view watching a movie, but there's a real buildup to disclosure. We have congressional testimony. We have Trump addressing it. We have supposedly the release of UFO files. And this is after about 70 years. If you saw a UFO, it's the planet Venus, or you're mentally ill, or with swamp gas. And now we've had a complete change. And I think we're prime for a false flag event along the lines of Bluebeam. And I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying about the phone. You're exactly right in what you're saying. It's omnipresent in what we do. But I wouldn't put it past them to not do a double-decker sandwich.
Uh, Double-decker sandwich. I like that. Well, you're right. I think they have the technology. I did address sort of the disclosure and its relationship to Project Bluebeam. You're right. They are ramping it up. What are they preparing us for? And then you also have people like Peter Thiel talking about the Antichrist nonstop to anyone who'll listen. So it's kind of it appears to be, you call it a double-decker sandwich. I call it maybe the two-pronged attack. So yeah, I don't know what they're planning exactly, but they do appear to be ramping up on both fronts, UFOs and the end times, perhaps.
Well, melding man and machine, often called transhumanism. I
Mm.
saw Peter Thiel on a broadcast. I saw it with my own eyes. There's no doubt it happened. He was asked when they were talking about melding man and machine, he was asked by the interviewer, he said, does humanity have a right to survive? He could not answer the question. He refused to answer. I don't know if you saw that or not, but he refused to answer the question.
Wow. Um, yeah, that's rather concerning, I'd say, wouldn't you?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, he says this too. If you put limits on AI, it's going to bring on the Antichrist. I go, wait a minute. If AI gets out of control and thinks it can manipulate humans because it's AGI, that's a whole different ballgame. That's where the Antichrist will come from. It won't come from controlling what AI can do.
I think there's a great deal of credence to what you're saying. Absolutely. AI, the gateway to the Antichrist, for sure.
Well, these people, this is my observation. And by the way, I'm a trained therapist. I used to do mental health therapy. I was a psychology professor for years. So I come at this from a behavioral standpoint. And what I see in the digital crowd leaders, Sam Altman, Peter Thiel, and I watch their statements and I listen to what they're really saying to us. These people are not operating on the same moral plane as most of us. And these people are highly manipulative. Sam Altman said, don't ever say thank you to AI. I talked about this morning on my show. And of course, it's not the same thing as saying it to a human, but people are programmed to be social creatures and be polite. And he's telling, don't do that. Well, his real motivation, he admitted to, was it takes up more memory and it's going to cost me money.
Mm.
Okay. But it's also teaching people to disassociate from who they are as social moral creatures. And this is what I think these AI people want. They want us to be almost disembodied souls who are dumbed down by overuse of AI so they can manipulate us for their profit.
100%. I agree with everything you said.
Are you seeing this in the music today the same way as you're describing with the Beatles?
To be honest, I am a huge fan of classic rock.
Me
So for
too.
me, you know, everything from Revolver 1966 up until what, maybe Frampton Comes Alive in 1977. That's the sweet spot. That's what I listen to primarily. Maybe I'm being narrow-minded. Yes, there is some good music. You have to really hunt for it today. I tend to gravitate towards sort of what I refer to as the old souls. These are young artists who are going back sort of to the roots of music and playing real instruments into microphones and recording, live off the floor in studio. Uh, that's the kind of music, but as I say, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. There is so much music out there now that just simply debases humanity, debases the culture. It's all intended, that's the intention, to debase. You look at art in general, whether we're talking about architecture and these ugly um, um, buildings that they're building that just make us feel hopeless, and we're warehousing children in these public schools that look like prisons. Whether you're talking about the other visual arts, painting, sculpture, it's just, most of it is just ugly. And I believe, and I'm sure as you do, in truth, beauty, and goodness. And art is supposed to be a reflection of those values,
Right.
and it is not, sadly.
Yeah, we're coming to, in fact, pastors will tell you this, we're coming to a real crisis of faith. And a lot of it is the social influence you're talking about. I think that's probably the most devastating thing we see. But, let me see, I have the data here on this. I do. There were some scientists from the Ivy League that collaborated on a study using AI. Okay, this is just, and the music's going to fit right into what I'm saying here. Um, First of all, if you use nothing to create something, your brain's activated 47% more than if you use Google. And it's 80% more if you use ChatGPT. And what I'm seeing too with music is it's promoting almost an anti-work, anti-responsibility attitude, which plays into this. So I think what you're talking about here is so important about the molding. It's almost like they want to dumb us down to the point where we don't care what they do to us, or we don't think there's anything we can do in response.
Yeah, that's the key, is they want us to despair, which I believe is a sin. Despair is to turn your back on God. That's what they want, despair. The good news is, not to get overtly religious here, but we just passed through. I'm Greek Orthodox, Pascha, or Easter. Christ is risen. Um, I we know how the film ends. Good triumphs over evil, but that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that we just kind of sit back and go along for the ride and wait for the resurrection, or our own resurrections. We have to still stand up against evil. The Bible and God demands that we hate evil and that we fight evil, even though we know that the ending is a good one. So we I don't despair. A lot of what's happening in the world today geopolitically is just noise. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't demonstrate righteous anger towards what is evil and so forth. But we can't allow them to grind us down and despair, ever, ever.
You really have opened up a can of worms here. I'm sure you've talked about this on other talk shows. What kind of reaction are you getting, first of all, from the so-called purveyors of authority, and secondly, from just regular people? Talk about the reaction you're getting.
You mean for the book or just for my work in,
I think both.
well, I've, from a very early stage in my career, I made peace with the fact that I was going to be, I guess, ostracized to the nether world of late night radio, which joke was on them because that's the best time of night to do radio, the overnight shift. I'm a frequent guest host on Coast to Coast, 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. Eastern time. There's no better audience. There's no more receptive or plugged in or tuned in or awake audience in radio than overnights. So I've never really had to, I've always felt like kind of a ghost throughout my career, walking into radio stations and studios when everyone else has gone home. There's no sales team there. There's no management. It's just me, my board op, and maybe the security guard. So, I've never really felt that pressure or that, admonition from colleagues. And I'm sure, at a Christmas party, they would look at me and maybe secretly roll their eyes or what have you. But it didn't really bother me, nor does it bother me now. The only people that I care about in terms of, what they think of me is God Almighty and my family. Everyone
Yeah.
else, it really doesn't matter.
No, I appreciate that. I'm friends with John B. Wells. So, and also I had a remote relationship um, with Art Bell, but I had very good friends that were on the show quite a bit, like Vance Davis and people like that. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut. These are people that were kind of in our intellectual circle. And so I know a little about how they work. So I got to ask you this question. I don't want to get you in trouble, so you can answer it as carefully as you want. John B. Wells ran into trouble with censorship, and his ratings were off the charts good. And they got rid of him because he kept talking about the wrong things. Have they loosened up a little bit at Coast?
I've never run into that issue in terms of, one thing I've been hosting or guest hosting rather. My first show was back in 2009, but I became a regular weekend host, if you will, starting in January of 2014. I made the rule for myself that I would never talk politics
Okay.
because number one, I felt like an interloper. I'm a Canadian, and for me to sit in that air chair on this tremendous platform and talk politics, American politics to American listeners, I just felt that's not right. I have political views. I'm a very political animal. I talk politics on my own platforms, but I don't talk politics on Coast to Coast.
I get it.
I also feel,
I get it.
they can get that anywhere on any other station. So, I don't know what happened with John B. Wells. I've been on with John's show. He's been on mine. I think he's a tremendous broadcaster.
Yes,
I could
he
listen
is.
to that guy read the phone book.
Yeah.
I felt the same way about Art Bell. They have, what I call the royal jelly. There's not too many people like that. But I've been treated very well at Coast. I've never felt, like that scene in Network with Ned Beatty telling, you have meddled with the primal order of nature and you will atone. I've never had that conversation.
Oh, that's a great scene in Network. I love that scene. Yeah, we just don't want to get mad as hell and won't take it anymore. But I think that's a lot of what this manipulation's about, to keep people from rising up and doing what you're talking about.
Right.
I think you're very insightful here with your early analysis, and it fits so much into what I see in the present day. Although you're right, it's more sophisticated today, but it's also more in your face. You're totally
Yes.
right about that. I think it's because when you looked at the time that you're talking about with the Beatles, it was a different era. It was God, family, country. Today, if you talk about that, people are going to look at you cross-eyed. At least many people will.
Yeah, they already won that war. Well, they think they've won that war.
I agree.
Let me
They
put it that
think.
way. They think they've won that war. So they've moved on to different terrain, different battlefronts, if you will. But it was a very innocent time. And that's why it was so insidious, because the Beatles came wrapped in this veneer of, cheeky rebellion. And we remember, in the 1950s, we had these DJs smashing records. Rock and roll has got to go. It's the devil's music. Well, they weren't wrong. They weren't entirely wrong. Um, but again, and I should point out also that the influence or the manipulation of popular culture and the arts is not the be all and the end of all of the book. That's section one. I also talk about the occult and curses and omens and the paranormal
Hmm.
uh, and murder. There's a entire section called Killer Chords, where I reopen the files of Jimi Hendrix, Brian Jones, Elvis Presley, Kurt Cobain. Um, I think people will enjoy that as well.
Well, let me ask you this before we talk about how people can pre-order your book. You got a show besides being on Coast. Your show sounds fascinating. How do people listen to it?
It's called Richard Serrett's Strange Planet.
Let me
Strange
spell
Planet,
let me spell your last name. Syerett. Is that right?
Syr
Syr. I'm sorry.
ETT.
Syrett. Spell sounds like carrot. Okay.
Serrett, yes.
Richard Serrett.
Richard
Okay.
Serrett's
Because so
Strange Planet.
how do people find your show?
Well, the podcast drops 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It is available everywhere, Spotify, Apple, Spreaker, you name it, it's everywhere. They can go to strangeplanet.ca. That's the website. They can subscribe to the podcast. They can stream it there. They can, if they want to get a little deeper, become a premium subscriber. They can also subscribe to my free monthly newsletter called Inner Sanctum. We just deployed the June issue on the tick agenda. And they can also find me on YouTube at Strange Planet Radio. So if they don't want to just listen to the podcast, they want to watch it, it's at Strange Planet Radio. My upcoming dates on Coast to Coast AM are also on the website strangeplanet.ca, and information about the book, Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, strangeplanet.ca.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate what happened to my friend John, but I will tell you this. Coast to Coast has had some of the most classic shows ever. And I mean, going back just to Art Bell, but even going forward with George Norrie, I think that makes you stretch your imagination and think. And I'll tell you, I'm surprised Charlie Kirk wasn't a huge fan, given how he liked to entertain all possibilities. Uh,
Maybe he was. Maybe he was.
Maybe he was. I knew him a little bit. We kind of interacted some on some of the say questionable governmental actions in Arizona, and we interacted a little bit. But I never got into that aspect with him. But really, your premise here is along those lines. Open up to all possibilities, and I think it's fascinating stuff what you're into here. How do people pre-order your book?
Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone is available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, I think even online at Walmart and Indigo. Um, I don't think you'll find it in the bookstore come July 9th, but you can order it online. You can also get more information. I've built a special website for the book called therockandrolltwilightzone.com.
Wow.
Therockandrolltwilightzone.com. You can even read samples from the book. And I've had some very nice comments from people like George Norrie, George Knapp,
Good.
Mark Farner, the founder of Grand Funk Railroad, Steve Lukather from Toto, wrote very nice things. That's all on the website as well.
Good company. Yeah, I did a couple conferences with George Knapp, and a great guy, and talk about knowledgeable,
Hmm.
and very much some of the paranormal stuff that's being looked at, like Skinwalker Ranch. Fascinating stuff. You've run in some interesting circles. That's fascinating stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Richard Serrett, and I would recommend listening to his show and then also pre-ordering his book. Richard, great stuff. I'd love to have you back on sometime.
Dave, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you for being such a great host, and I'm a phone call away.
Okay, thank you, my friend. Take care.
You too. God bless.